the Prohibition Partners reports have been pivotal in understanding the cannabis landscape. And be it, as you mentioned, the African continent, Europe, now you're venturing into the Americas as well. But how do you see the legal cannabis industry moving globally in the next 5 to 10 years? And are there any points that you would want our viewers to keep in mind for markets that need to be watched closely, perhaps from a not just a business standpoint, but also from the medical science and patient care, adult use, etc. So,
look, when we first started covering the industry, we had somewhat of an easy job, even though information was hard to come by. But the reality was there was under 10 legal markets, excluding, and I'm talking federally, and we obviously covered North America, but federal markets around the world. Today we've over 90 federal markets all over the world, and trying to keep track of the regulatory developments, commercial developments, and everything else, scientific developments, and everything else in between. So the challenge that's posed to us has greatly increased. But there's a lot of similarities and overlap in terms of how these markets are developing. There is no single pathway that each market is adopting. Every market is adopting a framework that suits their own regulatory environment, and that that makes doing business in an international context expensive, but also plays up opportunities to those who have significant experience from the pharmaceutical sector, who understand the supply chains of the pharmaceutical sector, because at the end of the day, it's a pharmaceutical product. In terms of when you talk of internationalization of cannabis, it is unless the UN says otherwise, it is a pharmaceutical industry. So there's the early adopters of cannabis, and those who are early in, especially in an international perspective. They were more raw entrepreneurs who came from tech, who came from finance, who came from other verticals. You didn't have the traditional healthcare executives coming into cannabis because, one, there was a stigma associated. Two, there probably wasn't the commercial clarity on the space. Whereas now the level of professionals moving in are moving from pharma, they're moving from life sciences, they're moving from healthcare regulatory companies, and they're coming in to solidify these cannabis companies, and their interaction with healthcare regulators is what is really helping to accelerate change within the landscape. They're usually quite expensive individuals and expensive experts, but that's kind of the maturity in where the global cannabis sector is going. You have to put on a suit and a tie sometimes to have conversations, of a certain nature, and that change in stigma and acceptability of talking about cannabis. Years ago, if I was talking of cannabis in an office environment, I get looks, whereas now it's very commonly accepted to have a career in space. But you speak of conservative countries, be it Indonesia and so forth, who are now adopting framework and commissioning studies and looking at how to integrate medical cannabis and what it means for them and so forth. It sparks a major shift on drug policy, but also the conversation around drug policy. But cannabis, for me anyway, personally, cannabis is just a starting point. It's an acceptance of society's drug use, and the fact, look, we're called Prohibition partners, but the reality is I would like to close Prohibition partners once Prohibition is finished. Our mission is to close off Prohibition, because it is the craziest policy ever in existence. It's done more damage than good. And if you're getting, even in Europe, Western Europe, traditionally more liberal than Eastern Europe, now Eastern Europe is coming quickly with new frameworks for medical cannabis. So every country is an island, but in a global context, you're seeing greater collaboration in terms of countries trying to understand international frameworks. And it's the same with the biggest influence, of course, will be the US, because it always is when it comes to the drug framework, and why, there's certain states like New York, while commercially it's still extremely challenging and it's an early stage, the influence of New York State, the approach the New York State has taken regarding social responsibility in terms of rollout within the state, that is going to set like a major framework when it comes to federal review of rollout. But also New York will continue to be the birthplace of brands and innovation, and that carries across to the rest of the world, influences Europe, and then has that knock-on effect. We're not at a place where people are scraping for information anymore. I think there is an abundance. Thankfully, there's an abundance now of basic information, but there's now emerging best practices on international guidelines. So, the approach taken by Germany is very different to the approach taken by the UK. The approach taken in Italy is very different to the approach taken in Thailand, for example. And that gives real world evidence, and it gives data that that can be used to advanced conversation, opposed to what it has done previously, is limited debates regulators could have in terms of the best framework for them. And that's, I think, what one thing we as an organization, as Prohibition Partners, attempt to do when we work with clients or regulators is, or even just the industry in general, is like, as we say, all ships rise scenario. If as the tide comes in, all ships rise. And for us, that level of understanding and data knowledge is kind of a basic right that the industry, should be available to the industry.
That's some great insight, and I like the mission of Prohibition Partners to close it down once prohibition is over across the globe.
Yeah. Hopefully we made a little bit of money, but
That's fantastic. And I really like the way how you've explained the regulatory landscape versus existing frameworks, and every country or every region kind of based on its history, their legal framework, and their outlook towards cannabis as a drug versus a medical substance is following different frameworks to come into the market and doing transactions across borders in ways that are very, very different. Even in Europe, as you mentioned, a Switzerland versus a Germany, versus how a Poland or a Greece or a North Macedonia is approaching on this industry. And market intelligence data, I think that's hygiene. But more than that, I think, as you mentioned, the compliances and the regulatory side of things, there's a lot of hand-holding that's required, especially in the pharma space and the API space, where people reach out to Prohibition Partners, and either you have the correct data or you have the correct partners that they need in order for them to build a framework.